What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and told you without saying a word that you didn't belong? Imagine sitting in seat 1A, first class, ticket paid in full. Your life's work finally taking flight when someone older, wealthier, and deeply entitled stands before you and insists that your presence is a mistake. What happens when silence is expected of you, but dignity demands a response? This is the story of Dr. Alina Monroe, a poised young black tech CEO on the verge of changing everything until a flight to San Francisco becomes the battlefield for a very different kind of power struggle. What begins as a simple misunderstanding unfolds into a confrontation that shakes an entire airline from cabin to corporate office. But here's the real question. When you're the only one holding your seat, will the world shift around you, or will it force you to move? Don't blink, because this flight is about to take you somewhere you didn't expect. If this kind of story matters to you, like, share, and subscribe. Now buckle up. You're about to witness a true story that redefines power, place, and presence. The morning light shimmered through the high windows of Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, cutting through the hum of travelers in motion. Beneath the soft, structured layers of a navy wool coat, Dr. Alina Monroe walked with the kind of purpose that couldn't be borrowed or faked. In her hand, a sleek passport holder and a printed first-class boarding pass, seat 1A, a seat she hadn't just paid for, but earned. Alina wasn't flashy, that wasn't her way, but everything about her presence calm, polished, deliberate, told a story far deeper than designer brands ever could. She glanced up at the departure board flight 221 Atlanta to San Francisco. She was flying west to keynote the annual Tech and Ethics Global Summit, the youngest speaker on the roster, the only black woman, and quietly, the most successful CEO of any company represented there. As she walked toward the VIP security line, she passed dozens of suits and tired-eyed executives hunched over laptops, barking into phones. She caught fragments of deals, mergers, market corrections, but let them pass like static. She had her own story to carry. Not long ago, she was coding until 3 a.m. in a dim studio apartment in Savannah, working 2 part-time jobs to afford server time for her prototype. She'd built MindTrace, a machine learning system designed to flag implicit bias in corporate hiring, and, ironically, it was ignored by every investor for years. Until it wasn't. Now, $2 billion rounds later, she was no longer invisible, but she knew better than to believe that visibility always equaled acceptance. At the TSA checkpoint, the agent barely glanced at her pass. 1A. Huh? He muttered, his brows raised just slightly before he waved her through. Alina noticed it. She always noticed it. In the lounge, she bypassed the champagne and charcuterie. Instead, she found a quiet chair by the window, took out her tablet, and reviewed her talking points. Her speech wasn't about technology. It was about ethics, about the small decisions that expose the true operating systems of our world. Her speech began with a story I once had a professor who told me, "You don't belong where you can't breathe freely." For years, I believed that meant I had to adapt, shrink, mold myself into whatever would fit, but I've come to understand he was wrong. You belong anywhere you show up ready, prepared, and unafraid to speak truth even when the air is thin. When the boarding call for first class was announced, Alina stood, smoothed the front of her coat, and walked to the gate. The gate agent smiled politely, but hesitated for a blink too long as she scanned the pass. That pause again, Then came the automatic line, "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Monroe." She stepped into the jet bridge, her heels clicking with certainty. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was already mostly full. Alina's eyes went straight to her seat, 1A, window side, the same seat she'd deliberately chosen weeks ago for its quietude. A man in his 60s looked up from his paper and blinked. A woman in pearls lowered her voice mid-conversation. She felt the shift. Alina placed her bag gently into the overhead bin, then sat with measured grace. She didn't fumble. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She had learned long ago that any hesitation would be seen as a crack in the armor, and cracks were invitations. Out the window, ground crew loaded luggage while golden morning light crept across the wing. She closed her eyes for a moment. You belong here, not because they say so, but because you know it. Just as she exhaled, a soft voice startled her. "Excuse me." She turned to see a woman in her late 50s, perfectly coiffed, clutching a monogrammed tote. Her tone was gentle, almost sweet. "That's 1A, isn't it? Are you sure you're in the right seat?" There was no malice, just a polite question soaked in assumption. Alina offered a practiced smile. "Yes, this is my seat. You're welcome to double-check the manifest with the attendant." "Oh," the woman said, her smile thinning. "It's just, I always sit here." Alina nodded, turning back toward the window. "Today, I do." As Dr. Alina Monroe settled into her seat, the scent of warm towels and lavender oil drifted faintly through the first-class cabin. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her back straight, posture calm, but her mind raced, not with panic, but with preparation. Always prepare for the moment they question if you belong. The woman who had addressed her moments ago, now confirmed to be Margaret Whitaker, stood just beyond the first-class galley, whispering urgently to a flight attendant. From the angle of her seat, Alina couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the choreography by heart, the tilt of the head, the subtle pointing, the furrowed brow of concern not about safety, but about order, class, expectation. The flight attendant nodded, politely neutral, and turned toward her. "Good morning, Dr. Monroe," he said, voice thin, measured. His name tag read Ethan. "Just verifying, may I see your boarding pass for seat 1A?" Alina didn't flinch. She reached calmly into the leather sleeve tucked in her coat pocket and handed it to him. He glanced at it, hesitated. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, but it sounded rehearsed, like a performance he wasn't invested in. "Appreciate your cooperation." Alina said nothing, just watched him walk away toward Margaret. Margaret smiled faintly as Ethan handed the pass back to her. She nodded, as if receiving the confirmation she expected, and yet she did not leave. Instead, she walked back toward Alina's seat, stopping beside it. This time, she brought someone with her, Carla Dean, a woman in a burgundy blazer and pearls who carried herself like a person who'd never been told no without filing a complaint. "Well," Margaret said cheerfully, "I suppose there's been a mix-up, but I'm sure it'll be sorted." Carla tilted her head and looked Alina over, not in the way women admire each other's style, but with a squint that said, "I don't understand how you got here." "We're both Platinum Premier," Carla offered, though no one had asked. "We fly this route often. Seat 1A's sort of a tradition." Alina raised an eyebrow, expression serene but alert. "Traditions change," she replied gently. especially when others start earning their place. Margaret's smile wavered. Before another word could be said, Sandra Mitchell, the flight manager, approached. She had the clipped gait of someone accustomed to diplomacy, not disruption. "Ladies, may I help with something?" Margaret immediately turned toward her. "Sandra, there seems to be a bit of confusion. I've always sat in 1A on this flight, and this young woman, well, she's been quite firm. Could you assist?" Sandra turned to Alina. "Dr. Monroe, would you mind showing me your boarding information?" Alina handed over the digital receipt this time. Sandra skimmed it. "Everything is in order," she said with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But instead of closing the matter, she added, "Still, if you'd be open to a gesture of goodwill, seat 3C is also first class, just as comfortable, and we'd be happy to offer you complimentary travel points for the inconvenience." Alina felt her breath pause just for a moment. Here it is, the push, the polite ousting, wrapped in compensation. She looked up at Sandra, then back at Margaret and Carla. "I'm not inconvenienced," Alina said, her voice quiet but clear. "And this is my seat. I'd prefer to stay in it." Sandra's expression barely flickered, but behind her eyes, something shifted. A calculation, not of seating logistics, but of risk, of what this refusal might spark. "Of course," she said, stepping back. But Margaret didn't move. She folded her arms and narrowed her gaze. "Young people today are so entitled," she murmured, loud enough for Alina and half the cabin to hear. Alina turned her head slowly, met her gaze with soft but unblinking eyes. "Sometimes we're not entitled," she said. "We're just no longer silent." Margaret scoffed. Carla chuckled in that forced, derisive way women in power sometimes do when their patience is being tested by someone they consider beneath them. Alina exhaled, turning back to her window. She caught her reflection in the glass. Still, poised, composed, but inside, her chest hummed, not with fear, with restraint. The old version of her, the grad student with scholarship debt and 2 jobs, might have apologized, moved, said thank you for the offer. The version who was told she was articulate for a black woman or too intense in interviews, but that version no longer flew coach. She sat in 1A, and she wasn't going anywhere. The hum of the cabin had settled again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet before something inevitable, the kind that lives between raised eyebrows and whispers behind newspapers, the kind that asks, "How long before someone makes this louder, Dr.?" Alina Monroe could feel the pressure building behind her seat like air tightening in a sealed cabin. Margaret Whitaker had returned to her seat 1B directly beside Alina. The proximity made the moment impossible to ignore. Neither woman looked at the other. Not at first. Alina opened her tablet, hoping to continue reviewing her summit speech, but her hands hovered above the screen. Her concentration had been broken, not by noise, but by presence. Carla Dean, still lingering in the aisle, leaned toward Margaret and whispered in a voice made to carry. "I just don't understand," she said, staring straight ahead but clearly referencing Alina. "These things used to be sorted long before boarding." Margaret responded with a clipped smile and a shake of her head. "It's not about the seat, dear. It's about precedent." Alina closed her tablet. She turned slowly. "Do either of you plan to say what you mean?" she asked quietly. "Or will you continue speaking in riddles just loud enough for me to hear?" Margaret flinched, but only for a second. "Well," she said, folding her hands on her lap, "since you're inviting honesty, fine. I've been a Platinum Premier member for 23 years. I've taken this exact flight every quarter for over a decade. I always sit in 1A, and frankly, I find it unusual that someone like you would be here." Alina held her gaze. "Someone like me," she echoed. "You know what I mean," Margaret replied, her voice trembling with tightly leashed civility. "Young, clearly inexperienced, and, well, eager to assert yourself in a space that has, let's be honest, standards. A few heads turned now. The first-class cabin, once quiet with indifference, had become alert. Passengers began to pay attention not with overt gestures, but in the ways that mattered. Phones lowered. Books stopped turning pages. Eyes darted over glasses. Carla moved to intervene, but Margaret kept going. "I'm not saying you're unwelcome," she added, "but when you've built up years of loyalty, of investment, it's a shock to see someone walk in with no sense of context." Alina didn't blink. "I booked this seat 4 weeks ago," she said calmly, "with my own card, under my own name, no favors, no upgrades, no inheritance, just work." Margaret smirked. "And a chip on your shoulder." Alina inhaled deeply, not out of rage, but out of clarity. "Do you know what it takes to build something from nothing?" she asked. "To walk into rooms where your presence is always questioned first, your credentials second, and your voice last. You think this seat is about comfort. It's about claiming space that people like you spent decades trying to keep closed." The cabin went still. Even Ethan, the flight attendant, hesitated at the curtain. Margaret straightened in her seat, her lips tight. "That's not fair," she said. "No," Alina replied, "but it's true." Then she turned to face forward again, her heart thudding not from fear, but from the weight of not staying silent. A moment passed, and then Margaret leaned sideways and pressed her call button. Ethan appeared seconds later, his smile automatic but strained. "Yes, Ms. Whitaker, I'd like to speak to the flight manager again," she said curtly. "This issue isn't resolved." Ethan nodded, glanced quickly at Alina, and disappeared into the galley. Here it comes, Alina thought, the escalation, the polite outrage disguised as customer service policy. For a flicker of a second, she felt the doubt creep in. Should I have let it go? Was that the moment I crossed into difficult? Was it worth it to speak up? Or will this turn into another long memo and fake apology from a PR team? But then she saw something. Across the aisle, a younger woman, maybe mid-20s, gave Alina the smallest nod. Subtle, a flicker of solidarity. She had headphones on, but her eyes spoke louder. "Thank you." Alina's pulse steadied. When Sandra Mitchell reappeared, her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her face professional, but the edges fraying. "Dr. Monroe, Ms. Whitaker, let's try to resolve this peacefully," she said, lowering her voice. "I know this is uncomfortable, but I'd like to ask again if you'd consider another seat. Dr. Monroe, just to ease the situation. We're happy to offer Miles vouchers." "I'm not here for Miles," Alina said, meeting her eyes. "I'm here to arrive, and I will, in this seat." Sandra faltered. Margaret looked stunned, and somewhere near row 3 someone clapped once, then stopped, embarrassed. Alina didn't smile. She just sat still, not angry, not triumphant, just certain. The air in the cabin had thinned. It wasn't just the altitude. Dr. Alina Monroe sat motionless in seat 1A, watching the silver gleam of the jet bridge door slowly seal shut. The plane was no longer just a means of transport. It had become an arena. Sandra Mitchell, the flight manager, lingered in the galley, speaking in low tones with Ethan Graves, the lead flight attendant. Their eyes flicked toward Alina, then away again. Whispers coded in forced diplomacy, smiles taut at the corners. From her seat, Margaret Whitaker wore a look of patient satisfaction, like someone who'd handed a problem over to those who fix things. Carla Dean sat behind them now, poised, arms folded, her eyes scanning the reactions of fellow passengers. Alina kept her gaze low, fixed on her open tablet, but she wasn't reading. Not anymore. She was listening, watching, waiting. Here it is, again. Not rage, not direct denial, but pressure, made palatable. A flight attendant approached not Ethan, but a younger woman with unsure eyes and a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, Dr. Monroe," she said softly. "Would it be all right if I confirm your ID just one more time?" Alina turned her head slowly. "Why?" The young woman blinked. "Just standard procedure." "No, it isn't." The words landed not loudly, but firmly, like a wall. "I've already shown my boarding pass twice." Alina continued, her voice composed. "My ID is linked to the reservation. If there's a specific problem, I'd be happy to discuss it directly with airline management. But I won't keep proving myself just to soothe someone's discomfort." The young woman nodded quickly, embarrassed, and retreated. Behind Alina, a cough, a scoff. "Margaret." "Well," she murmured, "it's not about discomfort. It's about verification. We all have to follow the rules." Alina finally turned, her expression unreadable. The rules seemed to shift depending on who's following them. Margaret blinked, thrown by the reply not because she disagreed, but because it hit too close. Ethan returned. He was all surface now, politeness painted over fatigue. "Dr. Monroe," he said, squatting slightly to meet her eye level. "We just want to ensure a smooth flight. Everyone's comfort is a priority." "And is mine not part of everyone?" Alina asked, tilting her head. A pause. Ethan tried again. "I understand this is a difficult situation. You're clearly very intelligent, successful, careful," she said, lips curling faintly. "You're drifting into compliments that sound like justifications." His mouth twitched, caught. She continued. "If a white man in a Navy suit were sitting here, would you be asking for identification? Would you ask him to consider moving for the sake of comfort?" He didn't answer. And that was enough. Alina turned back toward her window, not dismissively, but finally. She'd given them enough space to be fair. Now they had chosen. In the galley, Ethan and Sandra stood side by side. "She's not going to move," Ethan whispered, clearly rattled. "She's composed, but damn, Sandra, she's got presence." Sandra exhaled sharply, her patience fraying. "We can't escalate this, not visibly. Just keep her contained. Quiet. What if she contacts legal? Then we're already behind." They both turned when a passenger from row 2 walked up mid-40s, expensive haircut, Bluetooth in one ear. "Just so you know," he said, gesturing toward 1A, "I've seen this before. The younger ones make a fuss, then post it online. If you let it fester, it'll explode. Handle it quickly." Sandra smiled tightly. "Thank you for your advice, sir. We're doing our best." He returned to his seat, satisfied. But Sandra looked back toward Alina with new calculation in her eyes. In seat 1A. Alina sat still, but inside she was vibrating. Her heart wasn't pounding, but it was heavy. She thought of her parents, of her mother, who'd said, "Don't just work twice as hard." Alina, know when to make them see it, of her father, who rarely raised his voice, but once told her, "Silence only serves the system when it's comfortable for the system." Her entire career had been a balancing act. Speak too loudly, she was difficult. Too softly, not assertive enough. Dress too sharply, intimidating. Too casually, not serious. Today, she'd come ready to represent innovation and ethics at a global summit. And now she was being asked politely, professionally, to prove she deserved her space in row 1. She gripped her phone, still resting on her lap. The name Julian Knox sat at the top of her contacts list. Julian, the former ethics professor turned airline board member, her mentor, the man who once said, "Power listens differently when it knows you have access to power." Her finger hovered over the call button. If I make this call, there's no going back, no quiet exit, but another part of her, deeper and older, answered back. And if I don't, how many more will be quietly moved next time? She stared at the screen. Her thumb didn't shake, and then she pressed call. The call connected before the second ring. "Alina," said Julian Knox, his voice low and grounded, the kind of tone that didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't ask unnecessary questions. "What's happening?" Alina closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound of his voice anchor her. "I'm on flight 221 to San Francisco. First class. I was asked to give up my seat 1A because a longtime passenger didn't like seeing me in it." Julian was silent. Then, "Are you safe?" "Yes. For now. Has anyone touched you? Raised their voice? Issued formal orders?" "No, but they've asked for my ID. Twice. Suggested I move. Offered perks if I comply. The flight manager, Sandra Mitchell, is trying to make me disappear without making noise." Julian exhaled. She could picture him leaning back in his office chair, fingers steepled, gaze sharpening. "You did the right thing calling me. I didn't want to use this route," she whispered. "I know, but you're not just doing this for yourself, and you know that. I know." A pause. Then Julian's voice took on a new tone, one he used when he was no longer speaking just as her friend, but as a board member with power. "Stay seated. Say nothing more to the crew. I'll contact operations and the CEO directly. This won't just be addressed. It'll be remembered." The call ended. Alina let the phone rest on her lap. The low buzz of engines returned to the forefront of her awareness, followed by the distant sound of a baby fussing in coach, the occasional clink of glasses, the muted click of a laptop nearby. She felt her stomach twist not with fear, but with something quieter, the fatigue of being watched. Margaret noticed the call. Of course she did. She leaned over, trying to appear casual, her eyes full of suspicion. "Calling customer service." "Are we?" she asked, her voice syrupy but sharp. Alina turned to her, tired but still composed. "I called someone who makes decisions about how this airline treats its passengers. You'll hear from them shortly." Margaret's face twitched. "Well, I'm glad you're using your resources, though I doubt it'll matter." Alina said nothing. She didn't need to. Margaret filled the silence anyway. "You know, you're very articulate. I'll give you that. Passionate, too. But passion doesn't entitle you to override loyalty. Tradition matters." Alina let that sit for a moment. then loyalty isn't supposed to look like entitlement, and tradition loses value when it becomes a wall. Carla Dean leaned forward from the row behind, her voice lower, but dripping with condescension. You could have just moved, scored a few thousand miles, made it easier for everyone. Instead, you chose to create a scene. I didn't create the scene, Alina interrupted, turning her head slowly. I sat down. Others decided that was a disruption. The two women stared at her, but neither replied, because deep down, they knew it was true. In the cockpit, Sandra Mitchell had just received a call, not a routine one, a direct line from the Eastern Region Director's office. Her face paled. "Ethan," she said sharply, motioning the lead attendant over. "We have an issue." "What now, corporate?" "They've been contacted. Someone on this flight has a direct line to one of the board members." Ethan blinked. "Wait." Her. Sandra didn't reply. She didn't have to. Ethan exhaled. "Damn. We thought she was just another tech kid." "No," Sandra said, eyes narrowing. "She's someone who knows the system well enough to make it answer to itself." She checked her watch. "We need to do damage control. Quietly." Back in 1A, Alina stared out the window again. The sky was turning a softer blue, the sun no longer golden, but pale and cool. The flight hadn't taken off, but something had already shifted. She felt it in the quiet, in the way Ethan stopped walking past her row, in the way Margaret sat straighter but said less, in the sudden absence of eye contact from the crew. They knew. The system she had grown up learning to tiptoe around now realized it couldn't handle her with condescension, because she had stepped into it prepared, calm, and unshakably legitimate. Still, despite the turn, her body was tired, not from confrontation, but from restraint, from carrying dignity like armor, from standing still while the world tried to nudge her out of frame. She thought back to Savannah, to those nights she coded in silence, afraid of being too loud, too visible. She had grown up thinking power lived in money and position. Now she knew real power was knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to hold your seat even if the whole room pretended not to see you. And if today was going to cost her something, so be it. She could afford it now, because she had earned everything. For 20 minutes, the cabin sat in a kind of suspended breath. Flight 221 was still on the tarmac, its departure delayed with a vague announcement, final coordination with the control tower. But those in first class weren't fooled. They weren't waiting on weather. They were waiting on a decision, and it was coming fast. Dr. Alina Monroe could feel it in the air pressure, in the way Sandra Mitchell, the flight manager, had stopped making rounds, in the way Ethan Graves avoided looking at seat 1A as if eye contact might detonate something irreversible. She didn't know what Julian had said to the board, but she knew Julian Knox, and when he moved systems. Back in Skyhawk Air's Eastern Regional HQ, Julian Knox had just finished his third call. His hands rested flat on his desk, palms down, voice steady. "Yes, I can confirm," he told the CEO. "I've personally mentored Dr. Alina Monroe for years. She's a keynote speaker at a global summit this week. And yes, she's currently being targeted mid-boarding by your frontline staff over a first-class seat she purchased herself." There was silence on the line. "Are you suggesting," the CEO asked cautiously, "that this is a PR risk?" Julian leaned back in his chair, his voice lowering. "I'm telling you, this is a defining moment. Not just for her, but for us. If this story gets out, and it will. Your passengers will ask if she can be treated like this, who else will be? A pause. Activate the incident team. The CEO finally said, pull the regional director in, send someone to the gate now. Julian hung up and smiled. On board. The quiet cracked. The forward cabin door opened. Two figures stepped through. Their uniforms darker than the crew's navy jackets with crisp silver insignias and gleaming ID badges clipped at their waists. The woman in front moved with purposeful grace. Her presence alone silenced the aisle. Naomi Trin. She introduced herself. Service Quality Control, Eastern Division. Behind her, a taller man followed Thomas Velez, Regional Operations Director. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the rows like a general taking stock of a battlefield. Passengers stiffened. Several lowered their phones. One man cleared his throat nervously. They didn't stop until they reached row 1. Sandra emerged from the galley, her face pinched and composed. Thomas, she greeted. Naomi. We need to speak privately, Naomi said, her voice level, about what Naomi's gaze flicked to Dr. Alina Monroe, who met her eyes without flinching. This passenger, Thomas said firmly, and every choice that's been made since she boarded. Ethan and Sandra exchanged glances. Now, Naomi added, they stepped into the conference compartment at the rear of first class, the door sealing shut behind them. In their absence, the cabin buzzed softly. Passengers whispered across armrests. Even Margaret Whitaker, now visibly rattled, leaned into Carla Dean. What's happening? Carla didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. Margaret swallowed hard, then glanced sideways at Alina. You know someone, don't you? She asked under her breath. Alina turned to face her slowly. I know myself, she said, and I know when I'm being pushed out of my place by people who think they own it. Margaret said nothing, because in that moment, the illusion cracked. She'd thought she understood hierarchy status, tenure, perks, but she had never imagined the system would answer to someone like Alina, and that, more than anything, frightened her. Inside the conference room, the air was thick. Thomas stood with his arms crossed. Naomi remained seated, reviewing documentation from the crew. So let me get this straight, Naomi said calmly. She showed her ID. Twice, bought her own ticket, was offered perks to move, and you claim it was all routine. Sandra's eyes flashed. We were trying to de-escalate. No. Thomas cut in. You were trying to make her disappear, and now you've made it worse. Ethan fumbled for words. We didn't know who she was. That's the problem, Naomi said, standing. You thought that mattered. Sandra stepped forward, voice rising. This isn't about race. It's about managing discomfort. It's always about race when the discomfort only applies to her. Naomi snapped. When you let someone sit in 1A uninterrupted for 10 years, and the first time she looks different, you question her twice and offer her a bribe to leave quietly, that's not protocol. That's prejudice in uniform. Thomas looked at both crew members. Effective immediately. He said, You're both relieved of duty. Security will escort you from the aircraft. Ethan's knees buckled slightly. Sandra's mouth opened, then shut again. But my record will be reviewed after the investigation. Until then, you're done here. When the conference door opened again, Naomi stepped out first. She walked down the aisle calmly, pausing only when she reached 1A. Dr. Monroe, she said respectfully. "We sincerely apologize. You will not be disturbed again. Thank you for your patience." Alina nodded, her face neutral, but her eyes burned bright. As Thomas escorted Sandra and Ethan down the aisle, the cabin watched in stunned silence. Margaret shrank back in her seat. Carla looked away. And just like that, the rules shifted. For once, the price of prejudice was not invisibly paid by the victim but publicly collected from the enablers. The door to the jet bridge closed with a faint but definitive thud. Sandra Mitchell and Ethan Graves were gone. Escorted off, not in anger, not with drama, but in the kind of silence that makes things permanent. No applause, no confrontation, just the muted tension of privilege having finally met a wall it could not climb. And as the aircraft sealed again and pressurization resumed, first class shifted, not in sound, in posture. Passengers sat straighter. Some cleared their throats. A few stared at Dr. Alina Monroe, who still sat in 1A back against the seat, eyes out the window, lips pressed softly together. Composed, still, but something in her had clearly changed. She wasn't waiting anymore. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory parade. It felt like standing alone in a room after the music had stopped. Across the aisle, a businesswoman in her 40s leaned over and gently said, "Thank you." Alina turned, surprised. The woman didn't elaborate, just nodded, a quiet gesture of solidarity, one that didn't ask for anything in return. Behind them, the young woman with earbuds from earlier looked up again. This time, she didn't look away. She gave Alina a small thumbs up. Her hands were slightly trembling. Alina offered a gentle smile in return. Not alone anymore, she thought. Still, the aftermath came in waves. Adrenaline, once holding her upright, began to seep away. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She let her eyes close just for a moment, and that's when the exhaustion hit. Not physical, not even emotional, moral exhaustion. Because this wasn't just about a seat. It never had been. It was about how much effort it took to claim space that others entered without thinking. It was about how being right didn't protect you from being scrutinized. How dignity had to be performed over and over just to be believed. Margaret Whitaker was frozen. She hadn't said a word since the announcement. Her eyes were glassy, not with tears but with confusion, like someone waking from a dream where they were no longer at the top of the pyramid. Carla Dean sat stiffly, arms now uncrossed, fingers fidgeting with her scarf. The calm composure they'd used as armor was gone. Margaret turned to Carla and whispered, "Do you think they're really going to file a report?" Carla didn't answer. Margaret's voice lowered. "I was just trying to keep standards. That seat has always—" She trailed off, because what excuse could hold? Now the airline had spoken. The message was clear. It wasn't her seat anymore. In the back galley, Naomi Trin reviewed her notes. She'd seen it before. Incidents that were brushed aside, written up as communication breakdowns or passenger misunderstandings. But this one was different. This one had a witness named Julian Knox, a protagonist named Dr. Alina Monroe, and a cabin full of silent, complicit eyes that were now slowly, awkwardly awakening. And, more importantly, this one had consequences. Her phone buzzed. An internal message from the CEO, commendation, noted. All press inquiries rerouted to internal comms. Review procedures on implicit bias. Update me tomorrow. Naomi locked the screen and exhaled. Then she reached for the intercom and calmly instructed the cabin crew, prepare for departure. As the plane rolled back from the gate, Alina rested her hand on her armrest and felt how cold it had become. The adrenaline was gone, but her instincts were still alert, half expecting someone else to approach, to question, to ask for just one more thing. But no one did. Instead, a different flight attendant someone knew approached her row. A young man with steady eyes and a name tag that read Luis. He didn't ask for her ID. He offered a warm towel. "Dr. Monroe," he said with a nod. "Let me know if you need anything at all. You'll be undisturbed the rest of the flight." And then he moved on. She breathed out just a little. As the aircraft took off, and the skyline of Atlanta faded into distant haze, Alina reached again for her tablet. Her summit speech was still open, but now she scrolled down to the final paragraph, one she'd debated cutting. It read, "True change doesn't come from the center. It comes from the margins, the people who were never supposed to speak, never meant to lead, never expected to hold their ground. But they do. And when they do, systems shift." She read it again, then she highlighted it and hit save. The plane was in the air, its ascent smooth, steady, but in seat 1B, Margaret Whitaker felt as if she were falling. She stared straight ahead, past the curve of the bulkhead wall, past the outline of the curtain separating first class from everyone else. A curtain she'd long believed would always be there to keep people like her protected. Separated, elevated, but now she was the one separated. From comfort, from control, from entitlement. Everything about the flight had shifted, and not just physically. She could feel the temperature in the cabin had changed, not in degrees, but in respect. It had moved, left her, and it had gone to seat 1A, to Dr. Alina Monroe, the woman she had tried to edge out with a smile and a pedigree. Margaret had always believed in earned success. At least that's what she told herself. She'd worked, built a chain of boutiques with her late husband, flown first class not for luxury, but as reward. She wasn't born rich. She'd earned her upgrades. So why did it feel like that belief only applied to people who looked like her? The question scratched at her brain now like sand beneath silk, because if she had really believed in merit, she would have celebrated Alina's composure, her eloquence, her refusal to flinch. Instead, she had fought it. Margaret didn't want to admit it, but somewhere deep down, she had assumed Alina had gotten here by exception, not by excellence. And now, that assumption had been torn apart in front of her. Carla Dean, seated behind her, leaned forward gently. "Are you okay?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Because no, she wasn't. She was unraveling, quietly. And worse, she didn't know how to grieve the loss of something she'd never seen as privilege, only as normal. She knew someone on the board. Margaret finally whispered, "That's why this happened." Carla didn't agree. She didn't argue either. She just sighed, tired. That's not the part that mattered. She said, "It's how she carried herself. That's what changed everything." Across the aisle, Alina remained silent. She had sensed the mood behind her. She had seen the glances, the shifts in body language, the people who wouldn't look her in the eye and the ones who now did, for the first time, not with doubt, but with curiosity and a growing measure of respect. It was strange how nothing had been said since takeoff, but so much had been spoken. She turned to the window and let herself soften. Finally, she allowed the fatigue to settle into her shoulders. Inhale, exhale. You did not flinch. You did not leave. She remembered a line from a poem she once kept taped to her mirror. You will be tested in silence more than in storms. But when you hold your line, others will learn to see differently. She didn't need an apology from Margaret. She didn't even want one. What she wanted was for Margaret to live with the discomfort of watching her assumption dissolve without being allowed to sweep it away in a polite phrase. Behind her, Margaret sat still. She remembered when her husband was alive, how they'd joke about the VIP code, the unspoken rules of flying high. Always smile at the attendant first. He'd say, tip with a 20, know the names on the manifest. Never wear flip-flops in first. Keep it classy. Keep it exclusive. And it had worked. She'd been proud of playing the game with charm, not arrogance, but now, for the first time, she realized the entire VIP code had never been about class. It had been about preservation, of space, of identity, of distance from what made people uncomfortable. And here was Alina, graceful, intelligent, younger, black, and unshakably confident, refusing to move. Not yelling, not fighting, just remaining. And that quiet act had shattered the script. The attendant, Luis, passed by to serve dinner. Would you care for wine? Ma'am, he asked Margaret. She nodded numbly. Yes, anything red. Luis poured, then turned to Alina. Dr. Monroe, just water. Thank you. He poured it carefully, respectfully. Margaret watched the interaction. It felt like watching a world reassign its roles in real time. Luis didn't rush. He didn't treat her like a disruption. He treated her like she belonged. And maybe, Margaret realized slowly, that's what terrified her most. That someone else's belonging didn't have to come at her expense, but it still felt like it did, because it forced her to rethink everything she'd built her sense of self around. As the cabin dimmed and lights softened, Margaret closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Because for the first time in her first-class life, she was sitting next to someone who hadn't needed to be let in. She had just walked in, and the door hadn't closed behind her. The cabin had fallen into a rare kind of peace quiet, but full. An earned silence. The hum of the engines and the soft clinks of cutlery replaced what had once been passive murmurs of discomfort. Dr. Alina Monroe had returned to her tablet, drafting the final slides for her summit keynote. The cursor blinked calmly on a title slide, Ethics, Equity, and the Spaces We Take Up, across the aisle. A middle-aged man gently nodded to her as he passed on the way to the restroom. No words exchanged, just a glance, an acknowledgement. She gave a soft nod back. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but meaningfully. And then, like a thunderclap through clear skies, it snapped. Excuse me, it was Margaret Whitaker. Her voice rang out too loudly, breaking the soft hum of the cabin. Several heads turned immediately. Margaret stood suddenly from her seat in 1B, her napkin falling to the floor, the wine on her tray rattling slightly. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed. I have flown with this airline for over 20 years, she said sharply, not addressing anyone specific, just the cabin. I have sat in seat 1A more times than I can count. And now I'm being displaced, humiliated. No one responded, but everyone was listening, even Luis, the new flight attendant, froze mid-pour in row 2. I don't know what kind of favor she called in, Margaret continued, gesturing toward Alina, but this is absurd. I've given this airline more money, more loyalty, and more goodwill than half of this cabin combined. Carla Dean tugged at her arm from behind. Margaret, sit down. But Margaret pulled away. She gets one phone call, and suddenly I'm the villain. Her voice cracked. This is still America, isn't it? Alina closed her tablet and turned. Not hurriedly, but with a calm that sliced through the noise like ice. I didn't call in a favor, Alina said softly. I called for accountability. You called for power, Margaret snapped. No, Alina said, louder now. You assumed you had it. And now that assumption is gone, you don't know who you are without it. Gasps rose gently around them, not scandalous, not theatrical, just sharp intakes of air from passengers now witnessing the collapse of something that had once ruled their spaces in silence. Margaret's chest heaved. She wasn't just angry, she was frightened but couldn't admit it. Don't turn this into a lecture on privilege, she said, voice shaking. You're the one making everything about race, about power. I made it about my right to be treated equally. Alina interrupted, and I made it about respect, Margaret shouted. And then the cabin fell into full silence, because in that moment, the passengers saw it for what it was. Not just a confrontation, not even about the seat anymore. It was the implosion of a belief system right in front of them. From the galley. Naomi Trin emerged. Her steps were precise, her face unreadable. Ms. Whitaker, she said calmly, I'm going to ask you to sit down. Margaret turned to her, eyes blazing. This is unacceptable. You're going to let me be shamed like this in front of everyone. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply said, this is the consequence of actions, not shame. If you feel exposed, it's because your entitlement was never meant to be examined publicly. Margaret's lips parted, then pressed shut. You're disturbing the flight, Naomi continued. This is your final warning. A beat passed. Then 2 security officers stepped quietly into the cabin from the rear door. And that was it. The final thread of the old order snapped. Margaret looked around, but no one rose to defend her. Not Carla. Not the suited man in 2A who had once nodded to her on every trip. Not even the older couple she'd chatted with during pre-boarding. Everyone just watched. Naomi gestured gently toward the aisle. Margaret's feet felt like lead. Her mouth opened once more, but no sound came out. She gathered her purse. She turned toward Alina, not to apologize, but as if searching for something, a last shred of control or understanding. But Alina didn't return the look. She simply turned her gaze back out the window, peaceful. The sun had begun to set, casting golden light across the curve of the wing. Margaret walked down the aisle like a ghost in her own world, one that no longer protected her. When the door closed behind her, the silence was not awkward. It was earned. Carla Dean stared after her. Then, slowly, she looked at Alina. I didn't think it would go that far, she murmured. Alina didn't respond. She didn't need to. The cabin had seen it, and now it remembered it, cruising altitude. The fasten seatbelt sign dimmed, but no one in first class moved. They weren't afraid of turbulence. They were still suspended in the weight of what had just happened. Margaret Whitaker, the longest-standing Platinum Elite member on this route, had been escorted off not by technicality, but by accountability. and she hadn't slammed her purse down or shouted at the cabin door. She'd simply walked out under the gravity of her own undoing, watched by the same crowd that once greeted her with polite smiles and nods of recognition. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was cleansing. Dr. Alina Monroe didn't move either. She sat in 1A, her tray table down now, her tablet open to a new page. A page that had once been reserved for client strategy. Now, it held something else, a title forming slowly under her fingertips. What belonging really looks like. She didn't glance back. She didn't gloat. She just wrote. A soft chime rang overhead. The intercom cracked on. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Naomi Trin, Service Quality Control Manager, speaking to you on behalf of Skyhawk Air Leadership. Thank you for your patience. Passengers stirred slightly. Some looked up. Others leaned in. This flight experienced an incident of guest mistreatment that has now been formally addressed. In accordance with Skyhawk's non-discrimination and equity policies, individuals found in violation of those principles have been removed from duty or disembarked. She paused briefly. Alina glanced toward the aisle. Luis, the new attendant, stood motionless, hands clasped, listening just like the rest of the cabin. This is not merely a customer service issue, Naomi continued. It is a matter of institutional ethics. As of this moment, Skyhawk Air is launching a comprehensive review of our executive privileges protocol, loyalty program guidelines, and in-flight bias response training. There was a stunned pause. Then, we owe it to every passenger, not just our most visible ones, to ensure equal treatment and respect. We apologize for what happened today, but more importantly, we commit to changing because of it. A beat of silence. Then, unmistakably, someone began to clap. Just one pair of hands at first, then another. Not a standing ovation, not a scene, but an acknowledgement. A few light claps, then respectful stillness, and in that stillness, trust. Julian Knox's message had arrived loud and clear. It hadn't needed to name Alina. It didn't have to. What mattered more was that a system had finally backed someone it once would have quietly erased. Later, Lewis approached Alina with a small envelope. "For management," he said softly. "No pressure to open it now." She nodded her thanks. Once he stepped away, she unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note, Dr. Monroe. "On behalf of Skyhawk's executive board, we apologize. Not just for what happened, but for every time a system like ours made people like you justify their presence. We're implementing change, and we'd like your input. Thomas Velez." She stared at the words for a long time, then closed the envelope. Across the aisle, Carla Dean sat silently, arms folded, lips tight. She hadn't said a word since Margaret was escorted out. Now she turned toward Alina slowly. Their eyes met for a moment, and Carla, clearly out of pride and out of comebacks, simply said, "I misjudged you." Alina didn't nod, didn't correct her. She simply replied, "I know." The rest of the flight was uneventful, but not ordinary, because everyone on board knew they had just witnessed something few people ever do, an institution changing mid-air, a privilege revoked, a system reversed, a seat that stayed claimed not through shouting, but through stillness. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco. Current local time is 5:42 p.m. Weather is clear. Please make sure your seats and tray tables are in the upright position. Thank you for flying with Skyhawk Air. The tone was gentle, professional routine, but nothing about this landing felt routine, at least not in first class, because now the descent wasn't just physical, it was internal. Each passenger had witnessed more than a policy shift. They'd seen something rare, a narrative interrupted. Dr. Alina Monroe placed her tablet back into her bag. The screen had been off for nearly 10 minutes, but her thoughts had been racing, not about the summit, not even about the seat, but about what it took the toll of being composed under scrutiny, of having to carry every interaction like testimony in a silent trial. Her hands rested in her lap. She hadn't moved from her seat since takeoff. She hadn't needed to. Across the aisle, the man in 2A, a software exec, she remembered, leaned slightly in her direction. He'd been quiet all flight. Now he simply said, "You changed something today." Alina turned to him, waiting. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. It was the way he said it, not in admiration, but in recognition, as if what she'd done had reshaped the perimeter of the space they all moved through. A few rows behind, the young woman with earbuds had taken them off. She pulled a journal from her tote and jotted something down. Then she tore the corner of the page, folded it, and walked quietly up the aisle. She slipped it into Alina's tray without speaking. Alina looked down. A handwritten note. In neat block letters, "I'm 27. I've never seen anyone hold their place like that. Thank you. You gave me language for something I didn't know I needed." Alina exhaled softly. Not a sigh. A release. Even Carla Dean looked different now. Her arms weren't crossed anymore. She was sitting back, head turned slightly toward the window, as if trying to undo years of certainty with one long stare at a changing sky. She hadn't spoken again, but her silence was no longer stiff. It was contemplative, like someone rehearsing how they'd tell this story when they finally decided they were ready to admit it mattered. The sun was low now, casting long gold streaks across the floor of the cabin. Luis, the flight attendant, moved quietly through the rows, checking belts, offering mints. When he reached Alina's row, he paused not long, just enough to meet her eyes. "I'll remember this flight," he said, not because of fear, not because of scandal, but because someone in seat 1A finally stayed seated and the world adjusted to her presence. As the wheels lowered and the cabin tilted gently toward the Bay Area coast, Alina stared out her window. The Golden Gate Bridge was visible in the distance, bathed in amber. Below, tiny rows of home lined up like pieces in an orderly life. Up here, she was between worlds, between the expectation to stay quiet and the choice to be seen, between the unspoken rules of class and the unspoken burden of having to challenge them. She felt tired, but not small, and as the plane descended, she knew she wasn't landing alone. The plane touched down gently. Wheels kissed the runway with a hum, and the cabin swayed slightly before settling into its final glide. San Francisco International. Golden light spilled across the runway, the last notes of sunset painting the tarmac in hues of copper and flame. But inside first class, there was no chatter, no rush to stand, no familiar rustle of travelers eager to bolt. Instead, stillness. It wasn't fear, it was reverence for what had happened, for what had changed, for who had stayed seated, and what it had cost her. When the seatbelt sign dinged, Dr. Alina Monroe didn't move right away. She sat in 1A, hands folded over the envelope from the airline, her tablet tucked away, her shoulders slowly lowering. Around her, passengers gathered their coats, their bags, their dignity. Some looked over briefly, respectfully, not all, but many. And in those glances, there was no longer disbelief, only recognition. Luis approached one last time. "Thank you for flying with us," he said gently, "and for reminding us what flying should look like." Alina smiled. It was tired, but genuine. "Thank you for being part of the change." She replied. Behind him, Naomi Trin stood near the galley doors, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the cabin, not as a manager now, but as a witness. When Alina stepped forward, Naomi extended her hand, but instead of shaking it, Alina reached past and pressed the envelope her response to the airline's apology into Naomi's palm. No statement, Alina said, just action. Naomi nodded, deeply understood. In the jet bridge tunnel, passengers walked slower than usual. Some paused beside Alina, some gave nods, a few offered brief words. "Well done. You handled it beautifully. We saw you." None of them lingered, but none of them ignored her either. As Alina walked out into the terminal, her phone buzzed. A message from Julian Knox. "It's already gone up. Press will call. CEO's issued a memo. You're in the story now. Alina, not as a name, as a chapter." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she kept walking through Gate 17 past travelers checking monitors, past gate agents calling final boards. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt shifted, like something in her spine had straightened, not because of defiance, but because she'd held her ground with calm clarity in the face of a storm. Down by baggage claim, a woman caught up with her late 50s, stylish scarf, traveler's tote in one hand. "I was in 3A, she said. Alina turned, curious. "I didn't say anything." The woman continued. I just watched." There was no defensiveness in her voice, just the ache of honesty. Alina nodded once. "But you saw." "I did," she whispered, "and I won't forget it." They parted without names, but something had already been exchanged. By the time Alina stepped into her rideshare, San Francisco's skyline was twinkling in the distance. The summit awaited her in the morning, but something larger had already begun, because what happened at 30,000 feet wouldn't stay on that plane. A woman had held her seat, and for once, the world adjusted to her, not the other way around. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the story was everywhere, though Alina's name rarely appeared. The media called it the Seat 1A incident. Op-eds emerged about gatekeeping, about invisible bias, about dignity in spaces that were never designed for everyone to share. Skyhawk Air issued sweeping updates to its first-class policy, retrained all frontline staff, and eliminated its controversial legacy priority override. A new line appeared in the Skyhawk passenger charter: "No seat belongs more to history than to merit. No passenger deserves to feel less seen for being more different." Back in her office, months later, Alina kept the journal note from the young woman in her desk drawer. Sometimes, between meetings, she'd glance at it, not to remember what she'd said, but to remember what someone else had felt, because every seat holds a story, and sometimes holding yours quietly, firmly, fully, is what tells the world how to write a better one. They say every seat holds a story, but some stories don't just sit quietly, they stand for something. Dr. Alina Monroe didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue or plead. She simply held her ground with composure, clarity, and a strength that spoke louder than rage ever could. In that quiet defiance, an entire structure of unspoken privilege began to fracture live at 30,000 feet. This wasn't just a seat dispute. It was a moment that asked, who gets to belong? Who gets to decide? And what does it cost to challenge the rules no one ever wrote down, but everyone follows? Let this story linger in you not as a headline, but as a mirror, to honor what's right, to question what's easy, to challenge what's quietly unfair, because until every person, no matter their skin, age, gender, or background, can claim their space without fear, none of us are truly flying free. If this story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like it, share it. Subscribe for more stories that confront, uplift, and reveal what still needs to change. We'll see you on the next flight. Until then, stay grounded and stay bold.